Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today for our Practitioner Education Series webinar. My name's Erna Lay, Acting Team Leader of the Technical and Regulations Buildings team here at the VBA. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us are gathered. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. We recognise and value the ongoing contribution of Aboriginal people and communities to Victorian lives. As Victoria's building regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a confident and thriving industry. Today's webinar will be presented by Christian Williams, who is our Senior Technical Advisor for the Technical and Regulations Building team. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, we safeguard Victoria's future livability. Our role is not to set policy, but to support the industry to understand and comply with the rules. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understanding how to do things correctly and in discouraging risky, harmful or illegal behaviour in the building and plumbing industry. Our Practitioner Education Series is made up of a combination of masterclass and webinars. This series is aimed at the building industry and will help support the industry by providing practical insights, evidence-based strategies and useful resources. As you all know, today's webinar will be about waterproofing of wet areas. Please note that this session is being recorded and a link of this presentation will be made available on our websites along with previous webinars. We have set time aside at the end of this presentation for common question and answers. However, I'd like to draw your attention to the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen and encourage you all to type your questions there throughout our presentation. We have some technical advisors in the background who will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. What we don't get to live in this presentation, we will send an answer to the email address provided, or we will send out an overall FAQ to all attendees. There is also a chat function available throughout the presentation. We ask that any comments made in that chat functions are limited to constructive feedback, and we appreciate your professionalism in this regard. After the presentation, you will also receive a link of a short survey. Please take the time to complete the survey as we value your feedback about this presentation and other suggested future webinar topics. I will now hand it over to Christian, who will be presenting the content of the webinar. Christian.
Good afternoon all. My name is Christian Williams and welcome to our Practitioner Education Series webinar on waterproofing of wet areas. To assist the industry to prepare for the changes coming in on the 1st of May 2023, and in order to reduce the risk of non-compliant installation of waterproofing systems that can lead to defects such as water damage and deterioration of building elements, this webinar will provide an understanding of the key changes for waterproofing of wet areas for NCC 2022. At the conclusion of this webinar, viewers will be familiar with waterproofing requirements applicable from the 1st of May 2023 under the NCC, and will be able to identify key areas to achieve compliance and in turn reduce defects. Today's presentation will cover the new changes to NCC 2022 related to waterproofing of wet areas, as they differ from the provisions of NCC 2019 Amendment 1 version of the code. We will also be covering some of the changes to the requirements of Australian Standard AS 3740 from the 2010 version to the 2021 version of the standard, which is going to be referenced in NCC 2022. We will outline requirements related to performance solutions, such as the process for formulating performance solutions, and some specifics, such as departures from the waterproofing system specified under AS 3740. The documentation required for the issue of building permits will be discussed, including evidence of suitability. And to complete the webinar today, we will be going through some of the frequently asked questions live. Before we take you through the waterproofing requirements, we need to mention one of the main changes to the NCC, which is the new SPTC referencing system. To help improve the readability of both volumes, the Australian Building Codes Board, or the ABCB, has come up with what they call SPTC, which stands for Section, Part, Type, and Clause. This can be seen on the left side of the screen. Anyone who is familiar with the previous versions of Volume 2 should know that Section 2 used to contain the performance requirements, and Section 3 contained the deemed to satisfy provisions. Those two sections have now been combined into one section called Section H. Essentially, the aim for the change is to make all volumes in the NCC consistent. The section should be familiar, as it's largely the same as the current and past NCC volumes. To quote an example shown on the right side of the slide, we know Volume 2 is designated Section H, which is for Class 1 and 10 buildings. The sections are then divided into parts. A section can have multiple parts dealing with different aspects relating to the section. In our example, it is Part 4 to do with health and amenity. The type can be one of 7 options, as shown on the left, such as governing requirements, performance requirements, deemed to satisfy provisions, and specifications. In our example, the type is D, which stands for deemed to satisfy provision. The clause is always a number, and in our example, the number is 2. So if I go to the reference H4D2 in Volume 2, it'll give me the deemed to satisfy provision for wet areas. The flowchart on the current slide depicts compliance pathways for meeting the requirements of the NCC for waterproofing of wet areas. You can see, looking at the pathways for Volume 1 and Volume 2, that there are slight differences between the deemed to satisfy provisions for each volume. The waterproofing requirements for Volume 1 of the NCC come under Part F2, which references compliance with Specification 26 and Australian Standard AS 3740 2021. Whereas Volume 2 of the NCC references compliance with Part 10.2 of the ABCB Housing Provision Standard 2022 or AS 3740 2021. Of note is that despite using AS 3740 to achieve compliance for wet areas, Clause 10.2.1 to Clause 10.2.6 of the Housing Provision Standard must still be followed. The main difference here is that the pathway under Volume 1 requires compliance with both the specification and the standard, and Volume 2 requires compliance with either the housing provisions or the standard. Many of you will be familiar with the current waterproofing requirements under NCC 2019 Amendment 1. However, for NCC 2022, new waterproofing construction details have been added to Volume 2 under the housing provisions. This essentially means that there is now a new option for a deemed to satisfy solution that does not fully rely on having access to AS 3740 2021. So you're all probably wondering what the differences may be. Well, there are a few differences between the NCC and AS 3740, which we will discuss. AS 3740 does contain specific construction details and options, as it is a standard dedicated to waterproofing. It's been updated in 2021, which is now the reference version for NCC 2022. Information about the areas that are required to be waterproofed or water resistant can still be found in the NCC within specification 26 under Volume 1, and for Volume 2, it's under the Housing Provisions Standard. Again, the construction requirements found in the new deemed to satisfy provisions in the Housing Provisions Standard is not found in Volume 1. So for class 2 to 9 buildings, you must adopt AS 3740. One thing to note under Volume 2 of the NCC is that while you can use the Housing Provisions Standard or AS 3740 2021, you cannot mix and match provisions between them. For example, if you use the requirements from the housing provisions to detail a step-down shower, you cannot also use the fall and floor waste requirements from AS 3740. Handheld bidet sprays are a new provision for wet areas for NCC 2022. These are handheld devices, so do not apply to bidets that are built into the toilet. The current slide shows a detail of a plan view and elevation view of the waterproofing requirements for handheld bidets. The plan view shows the entire floor of the room must be waterproof. The elevation plan shows waterproofing must continue up the wall a minimum of 150 mil within a 900 mil radius of the wall connection of the bidet. The rest of the wall must be water resistant within the 900 mil radius to a height of 1.2 meters or 1200 mil. The plan and elevation view also nominates the 1500 mil radius from the bidet connection at the wall, but this only applies to Volume 1. Volume 2 is to meet the 900 mil radius from the bidet connection. In the ABCB Housing Provisions Standard 2022, which is referenced under Volume 2, the NCC now details step-down showers, which is a new inclusion. This requires that the highest finished floor level of the shower area must be stepped down a minimum of 25 mil lower than the finished floor level outside the shower area. This is quite different to AS 3740 2021, which only requires a minimum of 15 mil from outside shower area. There is one key detail you need to be mindful of when working between Volume 1 and Volume 2 for wet areas. And that has to do with the leak control flange, also known as a puddle flange. The housing provisions allows a flange to sit on top of the substrate, as shown in the diagram for concrete floors. AS 3740 requires the flange to be recessed into the substrate in the 2021, excuse me, the 2021 version. So for a house, you could install it above the substrate if you're using the housing provisions instead of AS 3740. However, for a class 2 to 9 building, it will need to be recessed into the substrate. Despite this allowance under the housing provisions, it is recommended that the flange is recessed into the substrate or the membrane to be installed over a screed in order to ensure that water does not pond around the drainage flange. It is important to note that despite the requirements for waterproofing under the housing provisions and AS 3740 that permit showers with hobs or step downs, from the 1st of October 2023, the livable housing design requirements under NCC 2022 will require at least one step-free shower in a dwelling. However, a 5mm lip is permitted if it is necessary for complying with the waterproofing requirements of AS 3740, such as for a water stop or a lip across doorways to prevent water from leaving the shower area, as shown in red. Another key change relates to waterproofing of shower areas. Currently, you only need to waterproof the shower area 150mm above the floor or 25mm above the maximum retained water level. Then you need to be 1800mm at the wall junction, as is shown on the slide. The change for shower areas is that you will now need to waterproof 1800mm up and on the entire walls, not just at the junctions. Another change are for floor wastes. The NCC 2019 Amendment 1 only required a floor waste in 3 situations. Those were shower areas, bathroom or laundries in class 2, 3 or 4 buildings, and rooms containing urinals. In NCC 2022, even if the floor waste is not required, but one was excuse me, designed to be placed outside a bathtub or shower, then the floor would need to fall towards the waste regardless. Taking a closer look at the fall to the floor waste change, AS 3740-2010, which is the current version referenced in NCC 2019 Amendment 1, allows falls to the floor finishes only to be 1 to 100, where the shower has vertical separation from the rest of the bathroom, such as where you have a shower screen. So looking at this photo, because there is a vertical separation created by the hob, you could have 1 to 100 fall under the 2010 version. When the NCC 2022 is adopted, shower falls will be increased for falls in shower area for floor finishes to 1 in 80. Falls in the substrate is a new requirement, which means that the floor waste in a wet area and the membrane applied to the substrate must be a minimum of 1 in 100 fall towards a floor waste. Another noteworthy change between the 2010 and 2021 standard is that particle board sheeting to AS NZS 1860 is not allowed to be used as a water-resistant substrate material for floors. The 2021 standard, the 2021 standard also makes mention that a visual inspection must be undertaken. Who can undertake this inspection is not specified. It could be the builder, the waterproofer, a building surveyor, inspector, or engineer. There are a number of other miscellaneous changes to AS 3740 for 2021. Coloured figures have been added to provide better clarity on installation requirements. There has been an expansion of the surface preparation requirements to include provisions for preparation of substrates, wall sheeting, and preparation of rendered surfaces. Shower and bath scenarios have been expanded to include additional installation requirements and examples. Additional materials have been added for both waterproof substrates and surface materials, and water-resistant substrates and surface materials for both walls and floors. There's been a slight change to the requirements for bond breakers for Class 1 membranes from AS 3740-2010. A bond breaker is a system that prevents the membrane bonding to the substrate in order to prevent failure of the membrane. The membrane can have restricted or non-restricted movement, depending on its bonding to the substrate. The way the membrane is bonded also affects the extent of the flexibility and elasticity of the product. For Class 1 membranes with an elongation at break less than 60%, a minimum bond breaker width of 75 mm is required with a 6 mm backing rod under the 2010 version. However, the use of the correct class is important, as over-elongation of a membrane can cause stress on the membrane that can lead to failures. So, for example, under the 2021 version of the standard, a Class 1 membrane with an elongation breaker between 10% and 59% now requires a minimum bond breaker width to be increased to 100 mm with no backing rod specified. AS 3740-2010 detailed the termination of a membrane to a drainage channel. AS 3740-2021 also covers the specific details, but now calls them linear drainage connections, and now requires the waterproof membrane to either be installed above or below the tile bed or screed. Under AS 3740-2010, the membrane drainage connection requires the waterproofing membrane to be terminated at the drainage flange or outlet. AS 3740-2021 now requires the waterproofing membrane to be bonded onto the leak control flange. Also, waterproofing membrane can be terminated horizontally or vertically at the flange. You can refer to figure 4.3.1 and B in the 2021 standard for further details. This slide shows some differences between the 2021 and the 2010 versions of AS 3740 with respect to waterproofing of bathrooms. Under the 2010 version, requirements for perimeter flashings or membrane termination in bathroom areas was 25 mm from the finished floor level. However, now under the 2021 version, it also permits the membrane or perimeter flashing to be 150 mm from the structural floor in the examples for protection of doorways. The 2021 version of the standard now includes an example for protection of steel frame architraves at doorways, and it now requires a 3 mm to 5 mm lap over the architrave. As discussed in the earlier slide, the use of particle board flooring substrates in wet areas for the 2021 version is no longer allowed to be used. In addition, where a water stop was required at doorways under the 2010 version of the standard, the membrane was only required to terminate to create a waterproof seal. But now under the 2021 version, the waterproofing must extend up the water stop angle. Something new for AS 3740-2021 is that domestic wet areas are now classed into 3 categories. This is based on the risk of water, hazardous conditions, damage to the building structure, and moisture causing potentially unhealthy conditions. Category 1 is the high risk, which can consist of, for example, enclosed and unenclosed shower areas. Category 2 is a moderate risk, which is areas such as the entire bathroom area outside an unenclosed shower area or outside an unenclosed shower over a bath. Category 3 is low risk, which are areas such as the bathroom area outside an enclosed shower area or a bathroom area without a shower area or a laundry without a shower. AS 3740-2010 only covered the general requirements for the minimum fall to the waist for bathroom floors, which was 1 in 100, for the fall to the waist in the shower area of 1 in 100, and for other shower areas being 1 in 80. AS 3740-2021 sets the requirements for falls to the floor waist based on the 3 risk categories mentioned earlier. Category 1 areas, such as the fall to the waist in shower areas, the minimum fall must now be 1 in 80. Category 2 areas, such as the fall to the waist on floors adjacent to the shower area, the minimum fall is 1 in 100. And Category 3 areas, such as bathrooms with fully enclosed showers, where the floor adjacent to the shower area has no floor wastes, there are no requirements for falls, and the water shall be retained only in the wet area. This part of the webinar discusses performance solutions. In order to achieve compliance with the NCC, the mandatory provisions are the performance requirements. As shown in the flowchart earlier in the webinar, there are 2 main pathways for meeting the performance requirements: by using a prescriptive deemed to satisfy solution or by formulating a performance solution. In accordance with clause A2G21 of NCC 2022, a performance solution is achieved by demonstrating compliance with all relevant performance requirements or by a solution at least equivalent to the deemed to satisfy provisions. Any solution that does not utilise a deemed to satisfy solution must be treated as a performance solution. This includes the use of accreditations, such as code mark certificates that certify compliance with performance requirements, and certificates issued by the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, or the BRAC, and even the use of an NCC verification method. Clause A2G24 sets out the process for preparing a performance solution, as shown on the right side. Performance solutions are typically prepared by an appropriately qualified person or consultant with the expertise in the relevant area required to prepare the performance solution. The first step in the process is to prepare a performance-based design brief, which defines the scope of work for the performance-based analysis, the technical basis for the analysis, and the criteria for acceptance as agreed by project stakeholders. The analysis is then carried out and the results of the analysis evaluated to determine if the acceptance criteria has been met. Lastly, a final report is prepared to document why and how the performance solution has been prepared, including demonstrating how all the relevant performance requirements have been met. It is noted that the Australian Building Codes Board have recently advised via their website that the process under clause A2G24 need not be undertaken again with respect to code mark certificates, as the certifying body undertakes a similar process in evaluating code mark. However, the same does not extend to BRAC certificates, and where a performance solution is based on a BRAC accreditation, the process under A2G24 must still be undertaken as advised by the BRAC. You can refer to the Building Product Accreditation page on the VBA website for details on this. We'll now discuss some specific examples of performance solutions. In recent times, we've seen an increase in the use of polished concrete floors in wet areas. The deemed to satisfy provisions under the housing provisions and AS 3740 permit the use of polished concrete floors where a water-resistant floor is only required. This is provided the concrete has been treated to resist moisture movement. Where a floor is required to be waterproof, polished concrete would need to be treated as a performance solution. This is due to concrete only being considered a water-resistant substrate and a water-resistant surface material. However, there is a method for using polished concrete under the deemed to satisfy provisions of AS 3740, which is to apply a compliant waterproof membrane over the concrete substrate, such as a concrete slab, and then to pour a topping concrete over the membrane in accordance with the specific provisions under AS 3740. The housing provisions does not have a specific method for using polished concrete floors, but the same method of applying topping concrete to a compliant membrane installation can be used. Any other method of using polished concrete must be treated as a performance solution. In addition, there is no DTS or construction details in the 2021 standard to allow for windows to be waterproofed within shower areas. Windows in these areas would also need to be subject to a performance solution. There has also been an increase in recent times in the use of timber flooring in wet areas. The deemed to satisfy provisions under the housing provisions and AS 3740 no longer have provisions for using any type of timber flooring as a substrate. Timber flooring is also not a compliant surface material in both water resistant and waterproof applications in AS 3740. Where timber flooring, including particle board, is proposed as being used as a substrate or surface material in a wet area, it would need to be treated as a performance solution. However, there is a method for using floating timber flooring that complies with NCC 2022. This is where the floating floor is laid over an already compliant installation. In other words, there must be a compliant substrate and surface material in place prior to laying the floating floor. An example of this could be a concrete slab with a waterproof membrane. The floating floor could also be glued down as shown on the slide. However, whatever the case, the membrane must not be subject to damage. Any other method of using timber flooring without an already compliant installation installed must be treated as a performance solution. The final part of the webinar before the Q&A session will be on the minimum requirements for building permits. When making an application for a building permit, it is expected that drawings include sufficient detail for the relevant building surveyor to determine compliance with the NCC. This includes drawing and section details of the wet areas, showing how compliance will be achieved with the housing provisions or AS 3740. Details for shower areas and bathroom floors must show all materials used and how they are to be installed, including but not limited to any floor wastes, membranes, water stops, and bond breakers. It is not sufficient for the drawings to just include a general note specifying compliance with AS 3740 or Part 10.2 of the housing provisions. We'll now discuss some of the documentation requirements for waterproofing of wet areas. In line with Part A5 of the NCC, all products, materials, and forms of construction must be supported by evidence of suitability where required. In terms of wet areas, there could be a number of products, materials, or systems that will require that evidence is provided to the relevant building surveyor to support the solution used to achieve compliance with the NCC. An example of this could be where a polished concrete slab is being in an area that is required to be water resistant. As the deemed to satisfy provisions under AS 3740 require the concrete to be treated with a product that restricts moisture movement, evidence of suitability that the product achieves this requirement must be provided to the relevant building surveyor for approval prior to installation. Another example is the use of a waterproof membrane product in areas required to be waterproof. The housing provisions and AS 3740 require that the product used complies with AS NZS 4858 wet area membranes. Therefore, evidence that the product complies with this standard must be provided to the relevant building surveyor for approval, again prior to installation. As discussed earlier on in the webinar, where a product used in a wet area is subject to a code mark certificate that certifies compliance with the performance requirements, this is a performance solution. However, clause A2G21 need not be followed, but if you're using a BRAC certificate, A2G21 must be used. A performance solution final report will be required to be submitted to the relevant building surveyor for approval prior to the installation. In terms of a final sign-off for the installation of waterproofing system, as many of you may already be aware, there is no specific legislated compliance certificate for waterproofing. Instead, depending on who installed the waterproofing, a certificate could be provided by an accredited installer or manufacturer of a particular proprietary system, or a letter of compliance outlining that the waterproofing systems have been installed in accordance with AS 3740 or the housing provisions. However, this evidence needs to be submitted to the satisfaction of the relevant building surveyor. So to summarise the webinar today, you have heard about the changes to the NCC, differences between the housing provisions and AS 3740/2021, and between the 2010 and the 2021 Australian Standard versions. You have also been made aware of the processes related to performance solutions for wet areas and have been advised what is required in relation to waterproofing for wet areas for building permits. From this webinar, you should now be familiar with the key changes to be released under NCC 2022 on the 1st of May 2023 for waterproofing of wet areas, and this should assist you in mitigating defects and installation non-compliances. I thank you all for your attention during the webinar, and I will now hand back over to Erna.
Thank you, Christian. That was great. We will now move to frequently asked question and answer that the team receives in relating to waterproofing in wet areas. So Christian, are you able to advise, I guess, the audience? I know you touched on this already in the webinar, but do I need a waterproofing certificate when work has been completed?
Thanks, Erna. Yes, I certainly can. So there are no prescribed certificates under the Building Act or regulations or NCC for waterproofing. However, at the end of the day, the relevant building surveyor must be satisfied. So in that case, evidence of suitability is required for waterproofing to demonstrate that the work that's been undertaken complies. In terms of the membrane, AS 3740 requires compliance with AS 4858. Therefore, evidence will need to be submitted to the relevant building surveyor from the product used for the membrane to show compliance with that standard. In addition to that, most building surveyors request that a stat dec or a letter of compliance is submitted to them, noting that the installation complies with AS 3740.
Okay. And Christian, are you able to talk us through the scenario where you have a floor-mounted vanity unit installed on a compliant bathroom floor outside the shower area? Does the area under the vanity unit needs to be protected?
I certainly can, Erna. Although the BCA and AS 3740 do not have a specified treatment for the junction between a bathroom vanity and the floor, the VBA suggests that people use a waterproof sealant such as silicone to seal the junction between the vanity and the bathroom floor. This is so that you don't trap water beneath the vanity, and the vanity should also not detrimentally affect the fall in the floor as well. So where the vanity is placed, the fall in the floor surface should be taken into account in that case as well. Okay.
And this leads us to, I think, the questions that everybody wants to know is a waterproofing inspection under 3740 required?
Yes. So for those of you who are not aware, clause 4.5.3 of AS 3740/2021 requires an inspection of a waterproof membrane prior to installing any overlaying materials. So this would be materials such as the surface materials. This is to ensure that there are no defects in the membrane, as once those surface materials are installed, it'll become very difficult to find where those defects are in the first instance and even rectify them.
Okay. In that case, then, who can undertake the waterproofing inspection to comply with that clause?
Thanks, Erna. Because this is not a mandatory inspection for the purposes of approving a stage of a building permit, and AS 3740/2021 doesn't specify who needs to undertake this inspection, it really should be someone that that has the appropriate knowledge and experience to undertake the inspection. This could be, for example, someone like a builder.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Christian, for that advice. That was great. Now, this brings us to the end of our presentation. I'll give 8 minutes back or 10 minutes back to the audience. I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. The recording of this presentation and our feedback survey will be available shortly. And please also make sure to check out our Victorian Building Authority website to see further upcoming webinars. Thanks again, and I hope everybody have a great day and afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.